So Facebook Live, take two. Howdy, Facebook Live. Sean Yesner here. We are doing a live recording of the Crushing Debt podcast, and so I thought I'd give you all a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at a recording of a podcast episode. My guest this week is Matt Lapointe, and we are going to talk all about debtor's prison and how that became the bankruptcy code here in the U.S. So I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Say hello to Facebook Live, Matt.
Hello, Facebook Live.
The only people I think we'll have on here are the staff here like to pop in and tell us they're on Facebook Live. But we'll see if we get anybody else. So let me try this again. On this week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast, Matt Lapointe and debtor's prison. So welcome back to the Crushing Debt podcast. My name is Sean Yesner, and I am happy to have a guest with me here today. My guest is an attorney friend of mine who I've known, how long have we known each other? 6, 7 years,
Yeah.
Something in that range. He does corporate and healthcare law, not only statewide, but in other states, in Florida, in Massachusetts,
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. I'm from Florida. I always get those northeastern
all those
states.
northeastern states. They all look the same to
Yeah, and so you'll notice he has a little bit of an accent. Matt's been practicing for over 25 years. He's currently working at a law firm called Blaylock Walters down in Sarasota.
Bradenton and Sarasota.
Bradenton and Sarasota. And so my guest this week is Matt Lapointe. He is also a history buff. And so I had an idea of doing a podcast episode about debtor's prison, because one of the questions I get asked most often is, am I going to go to jail if I don't pay my debts? And my answer always is, no, you won't, because there is no such thing as debtor's prison. And I knew a little bit about it, but I thought it'd be nice to do a little bit more of a historical perspective. And I know Matt does a 4th of July quiz every year. Sometimes I do well. Sometimes I think I'm born here but going to get deported anyway. And he also does Memorial Day. You tell the story of Memorial Day, and I know that you do a lot of history research, right?
I do. I enjoy history. I read a lot of history, a lot of biographies. It's just, my passion.
Yeah, so Matt and I were talking, and I was telling him the story about how I wanted to do a historical episode about debtor's prison in the U.S., and Matt volunteered to research it for me and then to be my guest on the podcast. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks a lot.
So why don't we just sort of jump right into it? What is debtor's prison?
So debtor's prison is what it sounds like. It's you can't pay your debts. A judge would sentence you to prison until the debt was repaid. Once you sold everything you owned, you sold your house, you sold your clothes, you sold everything. If you still owed money, a judge could actually send you to prison.
So if you're in prison, how do you make money? How do you pay back those debts that you owe?
Exactly. Well, you've pointed to one of the flaws in the system. But anyway, this goes back to, the 13th, 14th century is when this started back in England. And I think the issue was, they had to, I think there were two motivating factors. One was just the notion that if you're in prison, your family, your friends would get together. They would try to raise the money to get you out of prison. Secondarily, I think it was the interorum effect, the deterrent effect, right? You're going to pay your debts if you know that not paying them is going to land you in this stinky, dirty, cold dungeon with, typhoid fever and rats and all that stuff. So I think there were two prongs as to why they had debtor's prison.
So it sounds like prisons then were probably about as bad or worse than they are today.
They were pretty bad.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, when you were in debtor's prison, at least a regular felon, got food from the jail and got bedding and stuff. Debtors got none of that. Their family had to actually come and give them food and provide them with, clothes and stuff like that. It was crazy.
Well, and today, if someone in bankruptcy is being helped out by family, we have to disclose that on the petition as well. We have to disclose what kind of support, what kind of help they're getting from their family. So I know I did a series a couple of years ago. I did a social media series called Celebrity Bankruptcy, #Celebrity Bankruptcy. And every Friday I would tell a story about somebody famous or even semi-famous probably who ended up filing bankruptcy. And I know in that series I ran across a couple of people where my research said, well, this person would have been in bankruptcy had bankruptcy been available at the time.
Sure.
So are there any similarities? Are there any famous people
Yes.
who have been in debtor's prison?
Absolutely. Yep. One of the stories I've heard many times was that Charles Dickens was in debtor's prison. In fact, my research disclosed he himself was not, but his father was. And one of his books was called Little Dorrit, and he wrote Little Dorrit to describe basically what he went through as a young man when his father was in debtor's prison. The book Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens is about a little girl whose father is in debtor's prison and how she and her brothers and sisters try to get him out.
Wow.
So, yeah, Dickens was one. There were two founding fathers. Well, I don't know, maybe founding fathers is an exaggeration, but two signatories of the Declaration of Independence. To me, that constitutes a founding father. Anyway, there were two of them that were in debtor's prison. A guy named James Wilson, who, besides signing the Declaration of Independence, was appointed by George Washington to be on the Supreme Court. He was an associate justice of the Supreme Court and went to debtor's prison while he was an associate justice of the Supreme Court.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the other guy was Robert Morris, also a signer of the Declaration of Independence and also someone who participated in the Constitutional Convention to draft what is now the U.S. Constitution. And Morris was this really wealthy guy who at one time paid the Continental Army because the Continental Congress didn't have funds. He actually paid Washington's troops so that they wouldn't all just go away.
And he ended up
in debtor's prison because he got involved in some land speculation, not unlike what happened in this state throughout 2008, 2009. He got involved in some land speculation, ended up in debtor's prison.
Those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it, right? Wow, that's interesting. So I know that one thing that I always describe is that debtor's prison was started in England.
Right.
I always thought, though, that it was carried over from England to in other words, when the colonists came over, they were the ones who said no more debtor's prison. But I think your research showed that there was some form of debtor's prison that came over before it was later eliminated.
Yep, that's right. Early in our history, in the 1600s and in the 1700s, in fact, debtor's prison really only was terminated in the early 1800s. So that notion of debtor's prison came with the colonists to the colonies, and there were debtor's prisons throughout the colonies and throughout the early history of America, the 13 original colonies, the 13 states. So
what was it that did away with debtor's prison?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. It was really a slow progression, frankly. And historians talk about this progression from what they called the moral economy to what we now have, which is a market economy. Right. And the moral economy was the thinking about debt was that debt was evil. Debt was immoral. Right. And as the colonies were trading, as merchant trading became more common, and as commerce really started to become important, people realized you need debt for commerce. You need to be able to borrow money to buy the unfinished goods and then manufacture them into finished goods. The planters, right? Jefferson, right. Washington, they borrowed money to plant and then sent the cotton over to England to be turned into cloth.
Right.
So as the history progressed and people got to see that debt was in fact not shameful, but that was part of making commerce work, the notion of debtor's prison came to be seen as anachronistic and unfair and improper.
Although I know people today still think of bankruptcy as a 4-letter word, probably because of the changes in the code and whatnot. So it's interesting that sort of thought process has continued to carry on even to this day. So I think we've come all the way up towards now. You mentioned the 1800s. So what about the American Revolution? Is that
sure?
Where were we in terms of debtors' prisons while we were fighting for our independence?
So in that era, in the 1770s, debtors' prison was still going on. There were still debtors' prisons in the colonies, and after people may forget about this part of the history, but between the Revolution and the adoption of the Constitution, there was what's called the Articles of Confederation, and the new country had a very weak central government. During that period, the states still had their own laws, and some states were adopting bankruptcy laws, but they still had debtors' prisons. This is the interesting thing. What we brought with us from England was bankruptcy laws only applied to traders, to merchantmen, to businessmen.
Okay.
So the individual, the average Joe, couldn't take advantage of a bankruptcy. They had to go to debtor's prison.
Right.
The only people who could take advantage of bankruptcies at that time were the traders and the merchantmen. So what's interesting about it is after the adoption, well, let me get to the adoption of the Constitution. During the discussions of the writing of the Constitution, there was a motion made to, in the Constitution, say that bankruptcy laws would only be for merchantmen, for tradesmen.
Right.
And that was voted down. And so in our Constitution today, there's a clause, I had to write it down because I didn't remember it, but it's Article 1, Section 8, Powers of Congress, and it says specifically, Congress shall have the power to establish uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcy throughout the United States.
Right.
So the Constitution itself recognized bankruptcy and recognized it for everybody, not just merchants and traders.
And that's why bankruptcy is a federal law. So
exactly.
In order for me to practice bankruptcy law, I have to be admitted in the federal courts in the state of Florida. Now, where we get into the different states' rights is because each state could adopt, and most of them have, their own exemption schedule. So somebody living here in Florida will be able to protect different property, exempt different property than, say, somebody in Georgia or California or in any of the other states. But at its core, bankruptcy is federal law.
Absolutely. And the first bankruptcy law that was passed by the new, under the new Constitution was in 1800. And in that,
the Bankruptcy Act.
The Bankruptcy Act of 1800, that's right. And one of the reasons that act passed was, remember I talked about Robert Morris?
Right.
Robert Morris was in debtor's prison, and his friends in Congress, who knew him well,
right,
said, we got to help out Robert Morris. We're going to pass this Bankruptcy Act.
Wow.
And that Bankruptcy Act actually permitted Robert Morris to get out of debtor's prison.
Awesome.
So
our legislators were even looking out for themselves.
Even back at the beginning.
Way back at the beginning.
Yep, right at the beginning.
So then once the Bankruptcy Act was enacted, was created, was that the end of debtor's prison? More
or less. I mean, it took until about the 1830s. New York State was the first state to abolish debtor's prison. And the other states followed within the next, 3, 4, 5 years. So it was, again, this progression into this market economy, together with the Constitution and the passing of the Bankruptcy Act by Congress,
right,
that really pushed away from debtor's prison, where bankruptcy was something that was accessible to all, not
right,
just to the merchants. And that was what led to it. Another thing that led to it, frankly, was what people started doing studies and stuff, and they were finding that there were people in debtor's prison for like these tiny amounts of money, for like, $2, what would today be a couple of $100?
Right.
You'd be thrown in debtor's prison. People are like, this is crazy. Why are we doing this? So that was it. It was in the 1830s that the debtor's prison went away, that we started thinking more about debt as the oil that lubricates the wheels of commerce,
right,
and that bankruptcy was seen as an appropriate way to encourage risk, frankly, to get people to think commercially and to want to take business risk.
Right.
The idea was, well, you've always got the possibility that bankruptcy, you're not going to be going to jail,
right.
So,
which still, today, no, people don't go to jail. Now, what I have heard is if a judge issues an order in regards to a debt, like you have to answer creditors' questions regarding the assets that you own or something like that, and you fail to comply with that order,
Sure, you get contempt, right?
You can go to jail for contempt of court, but you're not going to jail for failure to pay the debt. You're going to jail for failure to abide by the court's order.
Yeah.
So were there any books or anyone else out there who wants to research this for themselves? Any material, anything, if somebody wants to follow up, you think they should?
I found a really good article in the New Yorker magazine by an historian named Lepore, Lepore. I'm forgetting. It's a woman. I can't remember her first name as I sit here. But that was a really good article that was very helpful to me. And then I reread a book that I had to read when I was in college by this Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was a Frenchman who came to the United States in the 1830s to see what, this new country was all about. And his book was called Democracy in America, and it's like required reading in Poli-Sci 101, any college you go to. And that book, I got a great quote of his that I want to read. He was talking about the lack of debtors' prisons and the rise of bankruptcy laws, and he said, Americans make a virtue of commercial temerity, right? Temerity is like boldness and risk-taking. Americans make a virtue of commercial temerity. Hence arises the strange indulgence which is shown to bankrupts. So in other words, he was talking about Americans' willingness to forgive these debts and how it lies behind our commercial success,
right?
And what how we were becoming a powerful commercial country. So de Tocqueville pointed out that this strange indulgence that we show to bankrupts was the very different from the way debtors were treated back home in France and in other countries in Europe. And he pointed out then in the 1830s, that's why his book is still read today,
right?
A real fundamental American character that is with us today. And, that is, we take risks for financial gain. Sometimes we fall flat on our face. We have bankruptcy. We can pick ourselves up and get back and try again.
And certainly I have stories. One of my best success stories, a husband and wife couple who filed a Chapter 7, a liquidation bankruptcy, and we eliminated all their debt. And then within 2 years after that, his business had taken off. Her business had taken off. They were able to buy a $300,000 or $400,000 house on a golf course down in your neck of the woods, down in Sarasota. Yeah. Completely recovered and are doing tremendous today because they got that fresh start. Sometimes bad things happen to good people.
Exactly.
So Matt practices, in addition to being a historian, basically corporate law, healthcare law, transactional law. You personally do not go to court and litigate, but you have partners and associates and whatnot at your firm who do.
Yes, that's absolutely
required.
Right. Yep.
So if any of the listeners want to get a hold of you because they have a corporate issue, they have a healthcare law issue, what's the easiest way for them to get a hold of you?
They can call me at 941-748-0100, or they can email me at mlapointe, that's MLAPOINTE, at BlaylockWalters.com. That's BLALOCK, Walters, WALTERS, BlaylockWalters.com.
And I'll put all that in the show notes. So if you're listening, you can go back to the show notes. That'll have all the contact information. And again, if you are worried that you're going to go to debtor's prison, give me a call. First of all, Matt will tell you you are not going to go to debtor's prison. And second of all, we'll help you figure out a way to avoid those creditors. And that's hence the title of the podcast, Crushing Debt. So I do want to really quick thank our sponsor, Polly Bauer and Associates. So Polly does the Swipe the Podcast show, and her show teaches you all about credit intelligence, a little bit about credit repair, and ways to keep your credit up or repair your credit if it has fallen. So that's it for this week's episode. We ran long, and thank you for the listeners, but I think it was deservedly so. We ran a little bit long. So enjoyed recording this episode of the podcast. Thank you for being my guest, Matt.
Thank you, Sean. I had a great time.
And we'll catch you in next week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast. And that'll do it for us, too, on Facebook Live. I don't know. Hang on, let me see. Yeah, we got a whole bunch of likes. We got a handful of comments. What kind of comments did we It's loading the comments.
Do we really want to know?
I don't know. we're still being recorded.
A couple of lawyers talking. You know, you don't know what the.
That's fantastic stuff.
What the comments might be.
Oh, you know, one of them was Tebow.
Oh, okay, great.
Well, we'll see what Mr. Tebow had to say. I can't see what Mr. Tebow had to say. So we'll sign off of Facebook Live for now. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching this recording of the behind the scenes. I will post this video to YouTube on the day that I post the podcast episode itself, and I'll send you all the links, Matt, so you can share it. And thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for your support of the Crushing Debt podcast, and we'll catch you next time I have a guest in office, in studio, I don't know what you would call this, to record the podcast. We'll see you next time.